This is the BioCentury Show.
Brought to you by the 26th BioEquity Europe, scheduled for May 2025 in Prague. Join BioCentury, EBD Group, and regional hosts IOCB Tech and Prague Bio at Biotech's premier CEO and investor conference and debate what comes next for European biotech.
Hello and welcome to the BioCentury Show. I am Simone Fishburn, editor-in-chief at BioCentury, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Daniel Mahony, one of, as we say, the big influencers in the UK, certainly in the UK life sciences. Dan joined Novo Holdings in early 2024 as a senior partner in growth investments. But that's after working for over 2 decades in the life sciences industry, I would say, early on in the finance sector, and then adding board roles in companies and as chair, importantly, I should say, as chair of the BIA, that is the UK's version of Bio, until the end of 2025. He started out with a PhD in biology at Cambridge. Some might even mention a BA in biochemistry at Oxford. He continues to serve as the UK's government life sciences investment envoy, and that is a role first appointed in 2022, reappointed in November 2024. So lots of background to talk about the UK sector, European life sciences, especially as we come up to BioEquity Europe. Dan, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Simone.
All right, that's good to have you. I really want to start, in fact, with the upcoming clinical trial reforms in the UK. These kick in to effect on April the 28th. I interviewed MHRA's CEO, Lawrence Talon, about them recently, and I think that there are some pretty interesting ideas there. Now, what I want to ask you is, there is this global race to become a destination for clinical trials. Obviously, China has raised the bar. But this is also part of the UK's life sciences strategy that we'll get into a little bit more. So how do you look at the UK as a competitor in that race, specifically becoming a destination for clinical trials?
Well, I think historically, say over the last 3 or 4 years, it hasn't been great. There have been a few efforts and it's definitely gone backwards, I think. If you go back 20, 30 years ago, the UK was a great place to do experimental medicine. But I think because of the pressures on our healthcare system, it's difficult for hospitals to run clinical trials. It's difficult for clinicians to get involved in clinical trials. We've had a couple of initiatives. There was one 2 or 3 years ago from Lord O'Shaughnessy that ultimately has led to these new proposals that came out of last year's Life Sciences Plan and NHS 10-year plan. And Lawrence, who I think you had on recently, or at least I saw the interview on the website, I think he's implementing some of these things. And I think some of the ambition that the UK's got to actually speed up clinical trials is a good thing, but it's competitive. I mean, particularly with areas like Australia and other countries who've got various initiatives for fast tracking. In Europe, Spain is one of the destinations for clinical trials. So it's competitive to get that. I think what's interesting from a UK perspective is there was a study done by the ABPI last year, so that's the pharmaceutical industry body, showing that if you ran clinical trials in a hospital, unsurprisingly, they were more likely to actually adopt those innovative medicines. And so there's an argument behind the scenes that we should be running more clinical trials, not because of the life sciences industry, but actually because it's better for patients here, which I think is quite a strong argument.
And of course, because you've got the NHS, you've got this integrated network of hospitals that, could be, we saw that in COVID, right? Just recruiting hospitals all over the country to participate in clinical trials. Dan, I think it's fair to say, I want to move more in a financing direction. And I think it's fair to say, when I listen to you, that you're both a big supporter of the UK, but not afraid to be critical. Okay. So hope that's okay as an introduction. Now, one of the big moves that you and I talked about a little bit before is the Mansion House Compact, I think it's called, which really in particular deals with pension reforms. I think that is something that is not clear to all of our listeners, certainly outside of the UK, why that's such an important thing. And maybe you could tell us about it and why this could make a difference to the UK.
Well, perhaps to give some historical precedence to this, and sort of, I actually did my postdoc on the West Coast, so I still have a 401k sitting somewhere in the United States. So I understand a little bit how the US system works. Going back a long, long time, there's a chap called Robert Maxwell, who was a newspaper proprietor, whose daughter...
We won't say whose father he is and where that all went, but keep going,
yeah. Leave that to one side. He ended up doing something naughty, which was essentially stealing money from his pension fund of that group. That led to a lot of legislation that came in just after 2000 that limited what pension funds could do. Now, over a 20-25 year period, what's that has done is it's massively reduced the risk that pension funds take. So back in 2000, a lot of pension funds were so-called defined benefit. So unlike a 401k, it's sort of more like a municipal pension fund where you get paid a fixed amount when you retire. Essentially, if you took they had what was called a balanced portfolio. So 60% in equities, 40% in bonds, which many of your listeners might think, well, that's kind of sensible. What's happened is the amount invested in equities has fallen precipitously. And certainly back in 2000, pension funds in the UK probably had 50% of their equity exposure in UK equities. That now is close to 6%. So in effect, over a 25-year period, we've had about 1.6 trillion pounds of capital come out of the UK economy. That's an enormous amount. And so that has an impact on everything. So obviously venture capital in life science is a small slither of that, but it's sort of at the riskier end. And what we've seen is capital essentially slowly drain out of the bathtub. So when I was out trying to raise money, rattling the tin for my fund at Polar Capital, I now understand in retrospect why it was so difficult. People just weren't getting exposed to equities in the UK.
So you're saying that, pension funds previously couldn't be limited partners in venture funds, which they are in other countries, right? And go ahead.
Well, they're allowed to be, but they, if you like, choose not to be because they didn't want the risk of it.
Right.
And so what we're having, so going back to the Mansion House Compact and then Accord, and what's now called the Sterling 20, which is 20 pension funds that have signed up for this, is there's an element of education that's required of what does it mean to invest in venture capital. We had a session actually at the Mansion House, which is where the Lord Mayor's residence is in the City of London. We had something on life sciences only last week with a group of 20 pension funds with people like Kate Bingham, a bunch of people who essentially are good investors in biotech, trying to explain why this is a good sector to invest in, and also noting that they barely have any UK investors in their fund, which I think for your US audience will find very difficult to believe that capital here isn't going into UK companies. But that's the situation. We have a lot of international capital here.
Okay, so there's a couple of things. Kate Bingham, big friend of the show, big friend of BioCentury, of course, right? We've spoken to her over the years a lot. And there are some big movers and shakers there. But I want you just to spell out a little bit. So, on the one hand, you talked about getting the pension funds around a table, because it sounds to me like part of it is a conceptual or risk appetite education or shift that's needed. But I think the end of this, or closing the circle on this, is like, what is the gap that this can fill? What difference? There are lots of places in the world where they have some of the issues that the UK has in growth capital. And so to what degree do you think that this will make a difference in the UK?
Well, an analysis we did at the BIA about 2 years ago suggested that we needed something like £15 billion, so about $20 billion of scale-up capital if we were going to actually grow some of our smaller biotech companies to a reasonable size. And that's particularly pertinent because if markets are closed, companies have to stay private for longer. It's more difficult to obviously IPO. And that's the quantum of capital that was needed for what was the substrate back then. Now, since then, obviously, more smaller companies have appeared. It probably still needs about that amount of capital.
So what you're saying is that, pension reform or unlocking that capital could make a substantial difference to the ability of UK companies to, well, maybe not seed, but to grow, right? And okay, go ahead.
Mainly to grow. Mainly to grow. So
Right.
I think that we've got a lot of companies being created out of universities. We've got a great science base. Everybody knows that. And sort of, if you look at the data, there's seed money. Series A isn't bad, but once you get to Series B and Series C, the amount of UK money begins to fall off, and you're relying on certain US funds who come over here, understand the value that's here, are writing the big checks and leading rounds. And I'm not saying we don't want that money. We need that money, and we need domestic money as well to actually fund all of the substrate that's being created out of our universities right now.
So I want to turn to a term that you've used. Let me get it right. Intangible deindustrialization as one of the UK's problems. And so you've talked about them being good at inventing things and creating institutions, but poor at capturing the economic rents, right? For me, and one of the reasons I'm leaning into this conversation is not only am I from the UK and it's important for the UK, but there are many countries places that BioCentury goes to, really outside maybe of China and even just two hubs in the UK, that talk about the same thing. They all struggle with how do we, capture and monetize, let's say, the innovations that we've got in terms of, and then create products for patients. So I think what would be helpful is to think about what are the solutions even beyond pension reform for the UK, and then how many of them are unique to that country versus transferable to other places.
So money is an issue, but it's not just money.
Okay.
It's partly about propagation of new technology across, if you like, the whole of society. So where you started on clinical trials, that's an important part of it. So it's about how do you get these ideas? And what we're very good at is we're doing little pilots. There'll be one hospital, they'll pilot, say, an advanced therapy, say a cell therapy or something like that. We don't propagate that across to the whole of the UK. And when you look at sort of NHS England, that's probably 65 million people. So, it's not, it's small in the grand scheme of things, but it's not that small. And I think one of the advantages of the UK is that actually we're small enough that you could get a lot of smart and influential people in a room, like Lawrence, Kate, other people. But we're large enough to actually have global impact. Because if you could find, say, the best way of getting cell therapy propagated across the whole of the UK, so it gets out into all of those places of society where those patients really need it, you can lift that up and take that into many other countries, including the US, but certainly into other systems that have socialized central medical systems. And I think that one of the things that we were talking about in the 10-year plan for the NHS, as well as the life science plan, is using the National Health Service as a propagation mechanism, using it to try and innovate. That's why Lawrence's reforms are so important, because that's the first bit. Doing the clinical trials is arguably the easy bit. Actually propagating it into standard clinical medicine is harder. But that includes drugs, includes diagnostics, includes devices. It kind of includes everything, really.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, because what you're saying is you can solve for the money, but there's still a lot of things beyond that.
Correct.
And certainly Lawrence Tallon and also Patrick Vallance, the Minister for Science, have talked about integrating the NHS and what it brings into solving the issues for the life sciences sector. We're going to take a break now. And when we come back, we're going to pick up this conversation and talk a little bit also about biotech in Europe.
The BioCentury Show is brought to you by the 26th BioEquity Europe in Prague, Czech Republic. Innovators everywhere are seeing speed as the driver of investment, partnering and success, speed to the clinic, speed to early human data, speed to de-risk assets. The question for European biotechs is clear. How do you compete in this arena? Facing new momentum from Asia and an unpredictable landscape in the US, the science in Europe is there. There are more experienced operators. And investor sentiment finally is turning. What's needed now is speed. In its 26th edition, BioEquity Europe travels to Central and Eastern Europe for the first time to explore emerging opportunities in the region and debate how European biotech can accelerate to compete and lead in today's world. Join us in Prague, May 4th to 6th, for this destination event for investors and biopharma leaders. Register at bioequityeurope.com. BioEquity Europe, where Europe accelerates to compete.
Welcome back. I am here at the BioCentury Show with Dan Mahony from Novo Holdings, who is also one of the UK's big names in biotech. And we're going to pick up that conversation. So, Dan, I've been looking at this. Now, I spoke to John Bell about a decade ago. Right? I think it was actually even before Brexit. As he was putting together, I think, what was then the first life sciences plan. And one of the goals that was laid down was to have 4 homegrown $20 billion biotechs. So not AstraZeneca and GSK, but homegrown biotechs. The UK is not there yet. But I want to ask you if that is the right goal. I mean, I would say China is a tremendously interesting and successfully growing their biotech sector. I don't think that they have got 4 $20 billion market cap companies yet either. Maybe the dynamics are different. But I want to ask you what you think. We at BioCentury think a lot about bellwethers, right? And bellwethers being important for actually creating an ecosystem. So how are you looking at the UK in terms of what it should be shooting for and measuring its progress?
So I had a small disagreement with John about that, because I didn't think market cap personally was the right measure, because that's obviously generating, that's value which is externally generated. I thought a better measure was companies that are generating $1 billion in revenue or $2 billion in revenue, whatever that metric is. Because for me, that means you're actually creating a product that must be having an impact on patients. So, well, from a biotech perspective anyway.
Right.
And I think that's more in control of management teams and companies than what their value might be. And so I think that's a better metric. But it also relates into some of the challenges for Europe, which is I think we've got to start paying more for drugs.
Aha.
I think we need end markets that can create viability for companies. That doesn't mean, in my view, necessarily you have to pay the same price as in the United States. And I know all about MFN and the pressures with that. But at the same time, the cost base, the liability risk, etc., in Europe is slightly lower. So you can have a lower drug price, but still potentially make as much profit from a company perspective. But I think we've had this, if you like, certainly in the UK, it's a race to the bottom to some degree. Different European countries spent different amounts of their percentage of their GDP on drugs. It was a big push to generics in this country, 20, 30 years ago, that has perpetuated. So branded drugs are only a small portion, if you like, of all of the scripts that are written, which probably is right for a social system. But ultimately, if you want to have a viable industry, then you need a market for it. You need a local market for it. And you have to have your companies can't just rely on the US for their profits.
So you actually led straight into my next question, because I think this is true for the UK and Europe. I think there's just a lot of tension on the UK right now, where pharma companies have absolutely said our issue is drug pricing. Now, the government softened its position recently. They increased the threshold for QALYs, by which NICE makes its assessment of what it'll cover, right? And the government has said it'll do more to pay more for medicines. So there's clearly some movement in that direction. There's reporting out that Eli Lilly is pushing for more, which I think is probably clear that they are. And that for them to invest in R&D in the UK, they want better deals on drug pricing. So, I really want to ask you how tied the two things are. Can you continue to generate newcos and grow them if you still have this tension between NICE and the pharma companies? Is R&D inextricably tied up with what the company can get in terms of drug pricing in that market?
So I think there are a couple of things there. I think the problem for UK PLC is the global farmers can come here for the research, and they could ignore the UK market and still get what they want.
Right.
So if you look at some of the things that are funded by the UK taxpayer, like Biobank, which is used around the world, our Future Health, which is sort of the super version of Biobank, which is funded by a lot of pharma companies. That will also start be disseminating data. For people who don't know, Biobank has 500,000 participants. Our Future Health will soon have 5 million and have much greater ethnic diversity because they've deliberately gone to every zip code or postcode in the UK to get samples in there. I think the pharma industry will still be able to tap into that research. And the challenge for us as a country, it goes back to this propagation issue, is that it's great for the taxpayer to spend all of that money, but if there's no economic benefit coming back in, it's not sustainable in the long term. And I think that that's something that's really important. And I think that when you look at drug pricing, I've been around the table with some of the pharma companies, CEOs of pharma companies have been very clear to the UK government, but it's difficult when everybody's health budgets are under pressure and they can't be seen to be just doling money out to big pharma, as it were, who make these exorbitant profits, which may or may not be true. I think it's certainly not true in the UK, given the way that the rebate mechanism works. Mm-hmm. And so I think that there are political issues with this. And I think the industry can't expect, say, the UK or Europe to jump the whole hog, if you like, in 1 year. But what you want to see is a series of improvements over, say, 5-6 years, which I think is what the pharma industry is pushing for. They're not politically naive. But at the same time, they have to look at what's going on in the US with most favored nation status and sort of what Europe is doing, what the European market is doing to their home market as well. And governments in Europe, including the UK, can't be oblivious to that. Sometimes it feels as though they think very siloed about this is the UK and this is all we've got. They don't realize this is a global industry and what happens here does have global impact, even if it's at the margin.
Are you concerned that with most favored nation policies that there will be companies that just say, well, it's just not even worth it for us to launch in the UK because it's going to screw my US price, and that the UK would lose out in that sense? Is that a concern for you?
I think it might decide how quickly they launch in the UK. Mm-hmm. That it's sort of every pharma company has, here the countries are launched first, then second, then there's a cascade. I think we move down the list, which is bad for patients here and it's bad for innovation here, frankly.
So let's move a little to Europe. Okay, we talked a lot about the UK. Now, Novo Holdings, where you are now, Novo is putting a fair amount of money, as I understand, into a life sciences scale-up fund. Maybe you can talk about to what degree the issues in Europe are similar to or different from what we've discussed in the UK, and why Novo is doing this.
I think Novo was doing it. I think they got asked by the Commission. I think it was when they had the president. Commission. Yes, European Commission. Sorry, I think when they had the presidency of Europe, sort of 3 or 4. It's sort of, again, for your US listeners, the presidency of Europe goes round the 27 countries. So you get
it rotates. Is it every 6 months or something?
Something like that, yeah.
They should do that with CEOs, like have a rotating...
Yeah. It came out of that. I also think that Novo Holdings itself, which, as you know, is the major shareholder of Novo Nordisk, was very aware of what's going on in the drug industry. And part of our investment philosophy is we invest in people and planet. We have a big impact fund. They realised that we needed to do something for Europe. The scale-up fund that they're setting up isn't just for life sciences. It's called the European Scale-up Fund. Life sciences is one of the verticals. Just think of it as things like clean tech, energy, other sort of tech verticals. I think our CEO at Davos said that they haven't done the first close yet, but they've got over 3 billion euros. And Novo will be an important first investor in that, as will the European Union, whether it comes out of the European Investment Bank, one of those mechanisms. But sort of, I think the problem in Europe is similar to the UK. There's a lack of growth scale-up capital. So I think the companies like BioNTech and Argenx made it, if you like, despite the system, not because of the system. And I think that what we have, the pension fund industry is very different, structured in a different way across Europe. But there is a risk aversion here. And ironically, some of those pension funds may be invested as LPs in US venture funds. There might be
More willing to
exposed
take the risk
biotech.
there. Yeah.
Yeah, so they might be exposed to biotech, but just not sort of in the local market. And so the purpose of that fund is sort of to create something that's going to be multi-billion euros that can help scale, if you like, the next generation of companies. Starting a lot of companies, but we're not getting them to any big size. You can see that in biotech as well.
So I think that, I want to get into some sort of specific areas of biotech where you sort of, which you're particularly interested in, but I don't think any conversation about the future of biotech in UK, Europe, or elsewhere is complete without talking about how AI is going to have its impact. And, if I take a step out of our industry and look at sort of small companies generally, there's a sense in which AI can actually be a leveler, right? You don't have to have the most sophisticated tech team in the world anymore because you can use AI to solve many of your problems and create products and efficiencies, especially for small companies. And so, we recently actually did a story on how VC firms are using AI sort of in some cases to improve efficiencies of finding opportunities, due diligence, and more. And I'm wondering, as you sit both on the board of a company, you're sort of involved in a bigger scale strategy, and you're also working in the financial division of a big pharma. What are the ways you are seeing AI deployed that, maybe excite you or you actually think could be game changers? And how big an impact do you think it's going to have on the trajectory?
I think anyone would be naive to say it's not going to have a massive impact. Mm-hmm. But I think it's also difficult to say exactly what that impact might be and how quickly it will be. So I sit on the board of Oxford Nanopore, for example, who I've been using AI before it was AI. They use neural networks.
Before it was sexy. Yeah.
Right. And so essentially, when a piece of DNA goes through one of their nanopores, it creates this squiggle that essentially they create base callers that uses artificial intelligence to determine whether it was a T, a C, a G, or an A, for example. So
just to round that concept out, basically it's real-time sequencing.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So their limit actually is processing power. They need NVIDIA to keep coming up with new processors because that means you can sort of read more with greater accuracy, etc. So though there are people, if you like, native AI companies, it's in the core of what they're doing. You've got a handful of companies, particularly around the King's Cross area of London, which is where Google is, and the Crick, who are using AI for things like protein folding and sort of trying to determine sort of, allosteric modulators, whatever it is.
The DeepMind kind of.
Correct, yeah. So I'm quite encouraged by that. I think that sort of sometimes we get, like all of these new technologies, everybody thinks it's going to happen in about 5 minutes, but actually sort of it takes a little bit longer, but the impact is much greater than you think. So I think some of those technologies are coming along. We're seeing, if you like, the next generation of AI approaches that those guys are implementing that could be very interesting. I think actually where we're seeing the rubber hit the road, ironically, is in the boring bits, which is things like clinical trial enrollment, designing clinical trials, producing regulatory documents. These are sort of, if you like, the nuts and bolts of drug discovery and drug development. It's not the exciting bit, but actually you can speed a lot of these things up and start improving efficiency. That's happening now. There are companies in the US doing that, and there are companies in Europe doing that too.
And I would think that for small companies, decreasing their OPEX, their operating expenses, with all the non-sexy things can sort of make their dollars go further. I would imagine that there's a sort of opportunity there.
Well, yes, but it's time as well. Remember, it's time to result is super important in biotech because your funding is always running out, as it were. So I think that's really important for some of the smaller companies, and they need to, I think, find ways of tapping into that, just to improve the efficiency of day-to-day activities, if you like. So I think, and what we find on the research side, in the investment research side, which I suspect is true sort of for people still working on the bench, the ability to sort of get into the literature and sort of find that paper, you think, I remember it from 20 years ago. I suspect everybody on this call sort of does that in some shape or form. Particularly the advances in the models in the last, 6 to 8 weeks have just been meteoric in the ability to sort of pull some of that stuff together. And when I now see a company that I don't really understand what they're doing, I just ask ChatGPT to explain it to me as a 5-year-old, and it gradually go up in age until the point at which
Hi,
I realise actually
I am a 5-year-old and I'd like to understand what this company does. Explain.
Yeah, that's where I start at 5 now.
Yeah. Well, here's my last question for you, because we're almost out of time. Is another one you can hand off to Claude or ChatGPT, right? So, you were chair of the BIA, right? You've handed that to Sean Grady from AstraZeneca, who you might be interested to know is a Middlesbrough fan. Just saying, right? Because I happen to be father's from Middlesbrough. Anyway, back on track. Perhaps you could talk about, I don't know if you want to think about unfinished business, but what do you think that, as I pointed out before, the BIA is the UK's version of bio, but it's actually got quite a different status in the country, and it's actually quite beloved, and it's actually quite integrated with many of the companies there. And I'm wondering, if you could ask Sean to do one or two things in particular, what do you think are the top priorities there?
Well, for my sins, I'm still on the board. They don't let you go when you step down as chair. You stay on for another year. I think that sort of possibly a serendipity. When I came on the board 4 years ago, I was in place when Silicon Valley Bank hit. Right. All the stuff we've been doing with pensions and stuff like that. It was probably lucky that we had a finance person there. I think the sector in the UK is beginning to grow up, and what I worry about, as it were, if we do get this money to flow, then we need talent. Right. And we also need to make sure that some of these companies will be commercially successful. And so I think in the same way that bio went through a transition, I'm going back 25, 30 years ago, where it went from being sort of, early cool discovery in biotech to actually being proper companies, by which I mean generating revenues and profits. I think that the BIA will need to start thinking about that too as our companies mature. So when I joined the board, which was 10 years ago, we had a real sort of academic focus. Academia is still an important part of that, but now we have more companies that have grown and have got larger and have raised decent sums of money. There aren't many, but there are still some $100 million plus Series A's going on in the UK. So we've got some proper companies here, and hopefully they will continue to raise capital and grow and possibly become, if not $20 billion market caps, generating $1 billion in sales. And that's, I think, where the advocacy and where the next phase of the BIA probably needs to be.
That is a great way to end. So what I'm hearing from you is that the BIA needs to prepare for success.
Always.
So that's a great place to end. And thank you very much for joining us today. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Simone. That was great.
Right.
Brought to you by the 26th BioEquity Europe, scheduled for May 2025 in Prague. Join BioCentury, EBD Group, and regional hosts IOCB Tech and Prague Bio at Biotech's premier CEO and investor conference, and debate what comes next for European biotech.
Kendall Square Orchestra provides the music for the BioCentury Show. The group connects science and technology professionals and other members of the greater Boston community to collaborate, innovate, and inspire through music while supporting causes related to healthcare and education.